Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Chimera's Core Studio. Welcome to the show. So today's episode comes to you courtesy of David, who's been supporting this channel as a Golden Pig tier patron. I truly couldn't do this without the support from amazing patrons like David, so again, David, thank you so much. And for this episode, well, David's actually going to handle the intro for me.
Hey Mitch, this is David from California. For my deck tech, I would like to see you build around Garth One Eye, focusing on opponent's choice.
So as David said, today's deck tech's going to be built around Garth One Eye, focusing on having our opponents choose. But with Garth, actually, we're going to be making some choices as well. Garth is a 5/5 human wizard for Wooburg, that's right, one of each colors, that says... Tap, choose a card name that has been chosen from among Disenchant, Brain Geyser, Terror, Shivan Dragon, Regrowth, and Black Lotus. Create a copy of that card, the chosen name. You may cast the copy. So Garth is a very flexible toolbox commander that can get us basically the exact card that we need for the situation that we're in. Well, at least for most situations, let's say. Disenchant, again, is 1 and a white for an instant that can destroy an artifact or enchantment. Brain Geyser is a sorcery for X blue that says target player draws X cards. Terror is an instant for 1 and a black that can destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. It can't be regenerated. Shivan Dragon is, well, a dragon that is a 5/5 flyer for 4 red that has pay a red. It gets +1/0 until end of turn. Whereas Regrowth is a sorcery for 1 and a green that says return target card from your graveyard to your hand. And of course, Black Lotus is a 0 mana artifact that we can tap and sacrifice to add 3 mana of any one color. So again, Garth is definitely a toolbox that can essentially destroy something that we need destroyed. It can make a creature if we need one. It can always get something back or give us some mana. And actually, Regrowth is one that can be really impactful in this deck because again, we're going to be utilizing a lot of cards that give our opponents choices. And well, sometimes we want them to make those decisions again. So by regrowthing one of our spells that we want to cast again, well, that can really help us out. And of course, yeah, I mean, just getting a ton of mana with Black Lotus, destroying other things, making a dragon, yeah, this can help out in a lot of ways. Now, with all the cards in this deck, including Garth, well, this is a very budget-friendly deck. Every single card in the deck is less than $1. And as I'm going through the cards on this episode, I'm going to be taking you through different tactics to show you how this deck works and how we're going to win with it. And of course, if you are interested in this deck, well, make sure you check out the deck list link in the description below. And now with all that said, let's jump into it. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we of course can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice to get a basic land into play tapped. Next up, we've got other turn 1 plays with Search for Tomorrow, Font of Fertility, and Indulgent Farmhand. Search for Tomorrow has Suspend 2 for a green. It's going to get us a basic into play untapped. And then Font of Fertility is basically an enchantment version of Wayfarer's Bauble. Indulgent Farmhand is basically a creature version of it. Both can be sacrificed for 1 and a green to get a basic into play tapped. And speaking of sacrificing for a land, well, there's Secure Tribe Elder, which we can sacrifice to get a basic into play tapped. And then Rampant Growth is another great turn 2 play, get a basic into play tapped. And Edgevon basically does the exact same thing. If we control 4 or fewer lands, we get that basic into play tapped. Or we can actually cycle this away by sacrificing a land. Moving on, we've got Cultivate, which gets us 2 basics. 1 goes into play tapped and 1 goes into our hand. And then Harrow and Roiling Regrowth are very similar. They're going to make us sacrifice 1 land to get 2 basics into play. Harrow has them come to play untapped, and Roiling Regrowth has them come to play tapped. Moving on, we've got Growth from the Ashes, which has Kicker 2, and if we kicked it, we get 2 basics into play untapped, or 1 if we didn't. And then Migration Path can also get us 2 basics into play tapped, or we can cycle it away. And then Verdict Mastery, we can actually just cast for a 3 in a green instead of 5 in a green. It says search your library for up to 4 basic land cards and reveal them. Put 1 of them on the battlefield tapped under opponent's control if the 3 in green cost was paid, and we get 2 on the battlefield tapped under our control and the rest into our hand, then shuffle our library. But when it comes to ramp that deals with our opponent's choices, well, we've got cards like Veteran Explorer, Rootweaver Druid, and Borderland Explorer. When Veteran Explorer dies, each player may search their library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them on the battlefield. Then each player searches the library this way, shuffles it. And then Rootweaver Druid actually provides a much tougher decision. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent may search the library for up to 3 basic land cards. Then they each put one of those cards on the battlefield tapped under our control. Then the rest of the battlefield tapped under their control. So that can be quite the tough decision. If they ramp themselves, they also ramp us. And then finally, there's Borderland Explorer, which actually doesn't ramp players, but it does help players hit their land drops. It says when it enters the battlefield, each player may discard a card. Each player who discards a card this way may search their library for a base land card, reveal it, put in their hand, and then shuffle their library. But of course, we've got plenty of other opponent's choice cards in this deck outside of ramping and fixing our mana. First up, how about some card advantage spells like Manifold Insights? It says really top 10 cards of your library starting with the next opponent in turn order. Each opponent chooses a different non-land card from among them. Put the chosen cards in your hand and the rest of your library in a random order. So we are forcing our opponents to choose cards that we are getting, much like with Fact or Fiction and Steam Augury. Fact or Fiction says really top 5 cards of your library. And opponents separate those cards in 2 piles. Put one of them in your hand, the other in your graveyard. And then Steam Augury basically does the exact same thing, but in reverse. We reveal the top 5 cards of our library, and we separate them into 2 piles. Then one of our opponents chooses one of those piles. That goes into our hand, the other goes into our graveyard. Still a very tough choice for them. And of course, we're not done with them making decisions. I mean, Unesh, Krausic Sovereign, and Sphinx Bethune are some great Sphinxes that can help with that too. Unesh is going to make our Sphinx spells cost 2 less to cast, and on top of that, whenever it or other Sphinx enters the battlefield under our control, we basically are Fact or Fictioning. But instead with just 4 cards instead of 5. Whereas Sphinx Bethune is, just basically a Fact or Fiction on an ETB. Separate into 2 piles, take one of them, Whereas Epiphany the Drown Yard is again more like that Steam Augury, but as an X spell. Reveal the top X+1 cards of your library and put them into 2 piles. An opponent chooses one of those piles, put that pile in your hand and the other in your graveyard. So we can dump a lot of mana into this if needed. Next up, if our opponents need to, well, they can prevent us from drawing some cards if they're willing to take some damage. Browbeat says any player may have Browbeat deal 5 damage to them. If they don't, target player draws 3 cards. Whereas Risk Factor is somewhat similar, but we get to actually pick that opponent. Target opponent may have Risk Factor deal 4 damage to them. If they don't, we draw 3 cards, and we can jumpstart this to do it again. And then Combustible Gearhulk is somewhat similar. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent may have you draw 3 cards. If they don't, you mill 3 cards. Then Combustible Gearhulk deals damage to that player equal to the total mana value of those cards. So that opponent might take the risk, and it might be the wrong decision. Next up, there's Covenant of the Mines, which says really top 3 cards of your library. Target opponent may choose to put those cards in your hand. If they don't, you put those cards into your graveyard and you draw 5 cards. Raz Allure the Unknown is going to get you 5 cards, but in a different way. It says really top 6 cards of your library. An opponent exiles a non-land card from among them, then you put the rest in your hand. That opponent may cast the exile card without paying its mana cost. So that is truly a big choice, what not to give you and what they actually want to cast. And speaking of choices though, there's Pendant Prosperity. It enters the battlefield under the control of an opponent we choose. And that player can pay 2 and tap it, and they draw a card and play a land from their hand on the battlefield, and when they do that, we also get to do the same. So this can lead to a lot of choices throughout the game. Next up, how about Imposing Grandeur? It says each player may discard their hand and draw cards equal to the greatest mana value of a commander they own on the battlefield or in the command zone. So we can discard our hand and draw 5, which is great, and our opponents, well, they can decide if they want to do the same, or, the amount of cards that they can draw is going to be different, but the same thing. Next up, there's Warnog, which has when enters or leaves the battlefield, each opponent may investigate. If they don't, they lose 1 life, and we're going to investigate X times, where X is 1 plus the number of opponents who investigated this way. So they can either choose to lose some life, or investigate with us, and we investigate more. And speaking of card advantage and sharing that with our opponents, well, there's Humble Defector, which has tap, draw 2 cards, target opponent gains control of Humble Defector, activate only during your turn. So it's their choice on who they send it back to, and hopefully we can be convincing enough for them to send it back to us. But of course, there are plenty of other decisions that need to be made. Like with the fantastic guided passage, it says really cards in your library. An opponent chooses from among them a creature, a land, and a non-creature non-land card. We get the chosen cards into our hand, then we shuffle our library. So this is kind of like the ultimate choice. I mean, an opponent gets to look through our entire deck and give us 3 things. Next up, how about Threats Undetected? Search your library for 4 creature cards with different powers and reveal them. An opponent chooses 2 of those cards, shuffle the chosen cards into your library, and the rest go into your hand. And then Ecological Appreciation is somewhat similar. Search your library and graveyard for up to 4 creature cards with different names that have mana value X or less and reveal them. An opponent chooses 2 of those cards, shuffle the chosen cards in your library and put the rest onto the battlefield. So depending on how much we pump into this, our opponents are going to have some pretty interesting decisions to make. And speaking of an interesting decision, well, next up there's Forgotten Lore and Shrouded Lore, which basically do the exact same thing. And Shrouded Lore is in older cards. I'll read its Oracle text. It says, target opponent chooses a card in your graveyard. You may pay green if you do repeat this process, except that opponent can't choose a card already chosen for Forgotten Lore, then put the last chosen card in your hand. Basically, an opponent can decide what we get back, and if we don't like it, well, we can pay green and they pick again. And Shrouded Lore is basically the exact same thing, but in black. And speaking of decisions on things for us to get back, how about Deliver Unto Evil? It's going to have us choose 4 cards in our graveyard, and an opponent chooses 2 of those, we get those back. So quite the big choice indeed. Or how about a repeatable choice that can happen throughout the game like Sin Prodders? It says at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library. An opponent may have you put that card into your graveyard. If that player does, Sin Prodder deals damage to that player equal to the card's converted mana cost. Otherwise, put that card in your hand. So if they really don't want us to have something, well, it's going to hurt them quite a bit. It says, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, target opponent may have you draw a card. If they don't, you may put a creature card with equal or lesser toughness from your hand onto the battlefield. So it's their choice. Either we get to draw or potentially get something into play for free. And we can also get card advantage in a different kind of weird way with Extract Brain. It says target opponent chooses X cards from their hand. Look at those cards. You may cast a spell from among them without paying its mana cost. This can be a very tough decision for that opponent, and yeah, we can get a lot of value out of this. Moving on, speaking of tough decisions, well, how about some that deal with potentially getting some great creatures with Animal Magnetism and Dubious Challenge? Animal Magnetism says really top 5 cards of your library. Opponent chooses a creature card from among them. We get that card into play and the rest into our graveyard. And speaking of sneaking creatures into play, well, the opponent can join us with one of those with Dubious Challenge. It says look at the top 10 cards of your library, exile up to 2 creature cards from among them, then shuffle your library. Target opponent may choose one of the exiled cards and put it on the battlefield under their control, put the rest on the battlefield under your control. So one of our opponents can get something nice as well. And then Sakashima as well says choose one if you control a commander. As you cast a spell, you may choose both. Target opponent chooses a creature they control, you gain control of it, and choose a creature you control. Each other creature you control becomes a copy of that creature until end of turn. So yeah, that opponent has to pick what they're giving us, and that might be, well, a deadly decision. Speaking of which, there's Tempt with Immortality. It has Tempting Offer. Return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Each opponent may return a creature from their graveyard to the battlefield. For each player who does, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if our opponents choose to do that, well, we can return quite a few things. Next up, there's Dredge the Mire, which says each opponent chooses a creature card in their graveyard. We get those cards on the battlefield under our control. So choose wisely, opponents. Speaking of which, there's Boneyard Parlay, which is kind of like a fact or fiction, but for creatures in graveyards. It says, exile up to 5 target creature cards from graveyards, and opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. Put all cards from the pile of your choice on the battlefield under your control, and the rest in their owner's graveyards. And speaking of choices, my goodness, can Perplexing Chimera. It says, whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may exchange control of Perplexing Chimera, and that spell, if you do, you may choose targets for the copy. Keep in mind, when this goes around the table, well, there can be a lot of swaps and a lot of choices happening. Next up, we've got some other creatures that can lead to some interesting choices with Desecration Demon, Reservoir Kraken, and Clackbridge Troll. Desecration Demon is a 6/6 flyer and says at the beginning of each combat, any opponent may sacrifice a creature. If a player does, we tap Desecration Demon and put a +1 counter on it. Reservoir Kraken is also a 6/6, but this one has Trample and Ward 2, and at the beginning of each combat, if it's untapped, any opponent may tap an untapped creature they control. If they do, tap Reservoir Kraken and create a 1/1 blue fish creature token with this creature can't be blocked. And then Clackbridge Troll has an 8/8 with Trample and Haste, and when it enters the battlefield, target opponent creates 3/0/1 white goat creature tokens. At the beginning of combat on our turn, any opponent may sacrifice a creature. If a player does, we tap Clackbridge Troll and we gain 3 life and draw a card. So again, these can be some really heavy hitters that can lead to some really interesting choices. But out of all the cards that force our opponents to make choices, well, there is one, in my opinion, that stands above the rest. That is the Golden Pig of this deck. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Agitator Ant. It's a 2/2 insect that costs 2 in red, and it says at the beginning of your end step, each player may put 2/1 counters on a creature they control. Goad each creature that had counters put on it this way. And goading, of course, means that until our next turn, those creatures attack each combat if able and attack a player other than us if able. So Agitator Ant, first up, can get counters on our own creatures, which is lovely, but also it can force our opponents to make some really interesting decisions. Again, if they choose not to put any counters on a creature they control, well, that creature doesn't get any larger, but also they're not forced to attack with it. And to attack someone other than us. But if the other opponents decide to do that, well, yeah, they are forced to attack, but that creature is going to get even deadlier. So it can lead to a lot of interesting plays, and it can force a lot of players to start swinging at each other in order to make their creatures more powerful. So yeah, Agitator Ant can be very effective and can lead to a lot of interesting decisions, and that's why it's the Golden Pig of this deck. But we also have some other ways to force some interesting choices, like with cards like Orzhov Advocus, Noble Heritage, and Tempt with Glory. Orzhov Advocus says at the beginning of your upkeep, each player may put 2/1 counters on a creature they control. If they do, creatures that player controls can attack you or a planeswalker you control until your next turn. So somewhat similar to the Ant, but also it doesn't allow them to actually attack us at all. Whereas Noble Heritage says, commander creatures you own have, when this creature enters the battlefield and at the beginning of your upkeep, each player may put 2/1 counters on a creature they control. For each opponent who does, you gain protection from that player until your next turn. Which means you can't be targeted, dealt damage, or enchanted by anything controlled by that player. So yeah, that is a lot. Or how about Tempt with Glory, which says, tempting offer, put a +1 counter on each creature you control. Each opponent may put a +1 counter on each creature they control, and each opponent who does, you get an extra counter on each creature you control. So yeah, if our opponents choose to get counters on their creatures, well, our creatures can get quite massive. But of course, even though we've got all these interesting decisions and choices for opponents to make, we're not done just yet. Because we also have some removal decisions that they can make too, with cards like Breaking Point, Cataclysmic Gearhulk, and Fortunate Few. Breaking Point says any player may have it deal 6 damage to them, and if no one does, destroy all creatures. Creatures destroyed this way can't be regenerated. And then Cataclysmic Gearhulk says when it enters the battlefield, each player may choose an artifact, creature, enchantment, and a planeswalker from the non-land permanents they control, then they sacrifice the rest. So that's a massive decision, and everyone's going to be losing quite a few things. Speaking of which, there's Fortunate Few, which says choose a non-land permanent you don't control, then each other player chooses a non-land permanent they don't control that hasn't been chosen this way, destroy all other non-land permanents. This can lead to some very interesting choices on what players want to keep in play and what players want to take out. Speaking of which, there's Eye of Doom, which has when it enters the battlefield, each player chooses a non-land permanent and puts a Doom counter on it. By paying 2, you sacrifice Eye of Doom and destroy each permanent with a Doom counter on it. Fraying Line can also lead to some very interesting decisions. When it enters the battlefield, you get a rope counter on target creature you control. And then at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they can pay 2. If they do, they get a rope counter on a creature they control. If they don't, you exile it and each creature without a rope counter on it, then remove all rope counters from all creatures. Basically, players can choose to either save one of their creatures and delay the effect, or they can choose for creatures just to go away. Next up, there's Decoy Gambit, which says for each opponent, choose up to 1 target creature that player controls, then return that creature to its owner's hand unless its controller has you draw a card. Quite the decision to make indeed. Moving on though, we've got Volrath's Dungeon, which its Oracle text reads, pay 5 life, destroy Volrath's Dungeon. Any player may activate this ability only during their turn though. And by discarding a card, target player puts a card from their hand on top of their library, activate only as a sorcery. So with this, we can decimate some of our opponent's hands and basically fate seal them with their own cards, or yeah, I mean, they can decide to, once it's their turn, pay 5 life and get rid of this. Finally though, one of my favorite cards, Curse of Echoes, enchant player. Whenever enchanted player casts an instant or sorcery spell, each other player may copy that spell, may choose targets for the copy they control. So players can choose to copy that unfortunate player's instants and sorceries, and yeah, if they choose to, things can get pretty out of control. But now that we've talked about every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the lands. First up, we're going to be running Command Tower, which can tap for any of our colors, Exotic Orchard, which can most of the time, and Path of Ancestry, which is going to enter the battlefield tapped. It can tap for any of our colors. Moving on, we've got Ash Barrens, which you can basically land cycle away, and Evolving Wilds, Temporary Expanse, both of which can be sacrificed to get a basic and a play tapped. Speaking of which, we're running Cabaret Courtyard, Broker's Hideout, Maestro's Theater, Riveter's Overlook, and Obscura Storefront, which can get us one of our 3 basics into play tapped by sacrificing these, and we also gain 1 life. And then next up, we also have some lands that can help ramp us with Crows and Verge, Mirror Landscape, and Blighted Woodland. And finally, we're going to round out this deck with basic lands, including, of course, plains, islands, swamps, mountains, and forests. But now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, let's talk about the price. And like I mentioned at the start of this episode, every single card in this deck, including the commander, is budget friendly at less than $1. So the estimated cost for this deck is, of course, very budget friendly as well at just $33.33. And actually, in that estimated cost, basic lands are counted at 10 cents a piece, so if you already have those basic lands, there's some extra savings for you there. And speaking of potential extra savings, you might be able to save even more by buying this deck on TCG Player and utilizing heavily played and damaged cards, which of course need a home too. Though do keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you, so make sure you comment below and let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.